Our next speaker is Rania Khalek. Rania is a Lebanese-American writer and political activist. She has written for politically progressive and left-wing publications, including The Nation, The Intercept, Al Jazeera, Salon, Vice, Alternate, Mondoweiss, and Truth Out. In 2017, she co-hosted the podcast show Unauthorized Disclosure, and she today runs a Breakthrough News, which is a very important podcast show, a video show. And as you will know, she has been paying a lot of attention to current events in Ukraine, and some of you will have seen her excellent interview with Boris Kagarlitsky. So, Rania, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And it's really an honor to be a part of this panel with all of these excellent speakers. I want to talk about a few aspects of what's taking place. And I think one of the most surprising things to come of this war so far is how there's almost no attempt to end it. And, you know, I've covered war zones for most of my career as a journalist, and I've just never seen a situation where there's almost zero attempt in the world to try to come to some sort of ceasefire. Everyone is escalating. And the US and NATO, we know, prepared the stage for this. Senior US officials and others have over the last 2 decades or more warned this would be the outcome of NATO expansion. And now that those warnings have come to fruition, the media especially is totally erasing the NATO and US role in pushing Russia into a corner. And that's not to justify anything or to say this was a great decision by the Russians, but they were painted into a corner. And how we got here, it's almost like the timeline starts as soon as the invasion starts, and we never hear what happened before that. And, you know, the capitalist media in the West has gone into overdrive manufacturing consent for dangerous escalation, not even 2 weeks into the invasion. And we're not even 2 weeks into the invasion. And according to a Reuters Ipsos poll, something like 3/4 of Americans would support a no-fly zone in Ukraine. I mean, obviously not knowing that the consequences of that could be nuclear Armageddon, which is another aspect of this that's being completely erased by the media. How dangerous this potential confrontation between nuclear armed powers, should this continue, how dangerous that is for the world. Meanwhile, the West is banning RT and other Russian media in a shocking display of censorship. I mean, the fact that they were able to implement the ban so quickly on the internet shows that the infrastructure to shut down opposing views was already in place and, you know, will at some point probably be used against people like us who oppose war. So really, it makes you wonder if this is, I guess, you know, one of the Western values that the US and these NATO powers claim to be fighting for by arming the Ukrainians. So now we're only getting, you know, one side of the story, which glorifies the Ukrainian narrative as pure and true, while shutting down Russian perspectives, shutting down dissenting viewpoints. And, you know, we know that in war, everyone lies. Everyone lies to benefit their own side. That's natural, that's normal. So it's crucial that we hear from everyone. So we can see what everyone's saying. We can see what the Russians are saying, what the Ukrainians are saying what the independent outlets are saying. And then we can get a general picture of what's taking place from there. But instead, we're getting this black and white framing of good Ukraine versus this evil Russia. And this drive to war with Russia has created this frightening climate of racism against Russians, of censorship, of militarism, a lot of which reminds me and many others of the post 9/11 era, where anybody who questioned it or opposed escalation or called for, or in this case is calling for the dissolution of NATO, we're all being branded as like these treasonous Putin apologists who need to be shunned and censored. And at the same time, we have the Biden administration openly funding an insurgency. The Washington Post has just reported plans for preparing the groundwork for Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine to lead a government in exile based in Poland, from where the Ukrainian insurgency will be organized, armed, and trained once they assume, they're predicting that the Russians win and taking out the government in Ukraine. You know, we saw Hillary Clinton on MSNBC days ago laying out how the Mujahideen in Afghanistan is the model, she called it the model for Ukraine, which is disgusting to say given what happened in Afghanistan and is still happening in Afghanistan. This obviously isn't about helping Ukrainians. It's about bleeding the Russians, fighting the Russians to the last Ukrainians. And at this point, funding and arming an insurgency, and we need to be clear about this, guarantees that bloodshed in Ukraine will continue for years. And just like with the unintended consequences from the Mujahideen insurgency, which is what Hillary Clinton called it, meaning the seeding of the precursor to Al-Qaeda, which later carried out 9/11, there's a similar danger of unintended consequences in Ukraine, one the media is already downplaying or outright ignoring. And this is perhaps the second most alarming aspect of this war. The empowerment of the global far right, which we've heard for years is increasingly dangerous. We have thousands of foreign fighters flocking to Ukraine right now with the encouragement of Western governments and the facilitation of the Ukrainian leadership under Zelensky. And we know that the US has already been arming neo-Nazi elements in Ukraine since 2014. They're the most ideologically motivated, so it actually makes sense for them to be flocking to Ukraine, because who else is going to fight an insurgency except for the most ideological people? And we know that far-right ideologues from the US and Europe have already spent time training with people in Ukraine. So you can only imagine how many of these so-called foreign fighters traveling there are motivated by this white nationalist ideology. And while Russia may have exaggerated the power of these people in the Ukrainian government, the US and its media stenographers are completely downplaying and whitewashing this, as we saw with a recent PBS interview that glorified a mayor of a Ukrainian town, as he had a picture of a neo-Nazi behind him and is known to be a part of a neo-Nazi group. And the hypocrisy of all of this is just astounding. The same leaders who invaded Iraq and killed 1 million people in that country, if not more, the same leaders who are currently, right now, as we're speaking, are starving both Yemenis and Afghans, the same leaders who label Palestinian terrorists for throwing rocks at Israeli tanks, the same leaders who took every opportunity to escalate rather than de-escalate the conflict in Ukraine since 2014, have suddenly decided that they believe in international law with regard to Russia, and they're celebrating and promising to arm this amazing Ukrainian resistance. And we can't let them forget, by the way, that they're starving Yemen and they're occupying Syria and militarizing Africa and starving people in Latin America, because, people will say this is whataboutism, but reminding people of this isn't whataboutism. It's essential to understanding imperialism and how their support for more war in Ukraine is a part of imperialism. And anyways, I'll leave it there. I also wanted to talk about sanctions. We can talk about that when I'm sure people want to bring it up in the Q&A session. I do just want to say that I think it's so important that we have panels like this right now, because we're really this is one of the only places where we can offer people analysis and an alternative to what they're being bombarded with in the mainstream media right now.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.